Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2020 Provost Lecture on Diversity, and I am that Provost. We're together in spirit, if not close proximity. Before I introduce our speaker and moderator, just a few words about this lecture series, how it came to be, and its importance to Penn and to our shared civic life here. The Provost Diversity Lecture was created as part of the university's 2011 Action Plan for Faculty Diversity and Excellence, which we continue to update. It's an opportunity to hear from both Penn faculty and experts beyond Penn about why and how diversity, inclusion, and equity matter in our scholarship, teaching, and clinical practices, in our shared community, and in the wider world. Recent past holders of the lectureship include Michael Jones Correa, President's Distinguished Professor of Political Science, who spoke last year about immigration, Catherine McKinnon, who discussed gender equality and women's rights, and Professor of Music Guy Ramsey, who discussed the history of African American music. Those are among many Provost lectures. We welcome and reflect on diversity in its many forms because it's critical to the academic enterprise and to everything we do here. Diversity, inclusion, and equity further Penn's institutional and societal responsibilities, among them achieving superior educational outcomes for our students, promoting innovative, diverse, interdisciplinary research, scholarship, and clinical care, advancing equal employment opportunity, and strengthening democratic institutions. This year has been and continues to be difficult. COVID has sickened millions and killed more than 210,000 Americans. Its outsized impact on Black and Brown people, a stark reminder of a highly unequal society. In many ways, our faith has been shaken. Our faith not just in our leaders, our institutions, and our democracy, but more broadly in the intentions of our fellow Americans. We question, I find myself questioning, how we can make progress and build a more just society when so many are filled with anger, resentment, and fear. This year, in frustration, tens of millions of Americans have poured onto the streets in protest to express unity and dissatisfaction with the status quo. Yet when the marches end, we're often left to wonder, do our protests matter? Will anything actually come of them? It's an issue of stark relevance today. In a 2017 book, the Columbia political scientist Mark Lilla, whom you may recall penned a widely read essay after the 2016 election urging an end to so-called identity politics, advocates an abandonment of protest and a return to what he calls governmental process. The age of movement politics is over, at least for now, he writes. We need no more marchers. We need more mayors. We certainly need more and more effective political leadership. There's no argument there. But in a year when millions have taken to the streets to demand justice and equality, it seems clear to me that the death of grassroots activism has been greatly exaggerated. Mass protest is, once again, having its moment. I look at these protests and I'm filled with hope. Because this time around, the diversity of our protests is their greatest asset. Professor Dan Gillian, our speaker today, argues that protests don't just matter, they are foundational to a well-functioning democracy. In his book, The Political Power of Protest, Minority Activism and Shifts in Public Policy, Dan convincingly demonstrates the critical role protest plays in driving change in all branches of government. The protest drives voter turnout. It shapes public policy and increases engagement. And it is often the leading indicator of broad social, cultural, and political change. Let's hope so. His most recent book, Governing with Words, was awarded the 2017 W.B. Du Bois Book Award from the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Lilla contends we need better and more responsive government. But how do we get there? As Dan argues, we make our voices heard. And he certainly has. He recently received the so-called Brainy Award by being selected as a Carnegie Fellow. At Penn, Dan is the Julie Barron Platt and Mark E. Platt Presidential Distinguished Professor of Political Science. Joining our conversation today is Laura Perna, who will facilitate the discussion. Laura is Vice Provost for Faculty and Centennial Presidential Professor of Education in the Graduate School of Education. A past chair of the Faculty Senate, last year she was elected to the National Academy of Education. She's also a recipient of the Lindback Award, Penn's highest honor in teaching. Please join me in welcoming Professors Dan Gillian and Laura Perna.
Thank you, Wendell. Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased that you were able to join us today for the Provost 2020 Lecture on Diversity. As we come together, we are at the brink of an election that feels undeniably important, with a record turnout predicted and a level of racial and social unrest that we have not seen since the 1960s. I'm sure that you are as excited as I am to engage with Professor Daniel Gillian about the meaning and implications of this moment for our nation. To make visible the structure of this session, Professor Gillian will first present on some of his important work. Then he and I will engage in conversation about some of the ideas that he presents. Dan, thank you so much for your important work. We look forward to having this opportunity to learn from you.
It was so hot on that day. It was back in 1995. I'm walking amongst thousands of individuals. I'm carrying a sign that says, "Racial equality now." I'm in the midst of the protest. It's my first protest ever. Back in Washington, D.C., the Million Man March was taking place. And I couldn't make it out there. I couldn't even afford it. So I went to a satellite protest in Miami. I jumped on a tri-rail, then took a metro rail, then took a bus to be in the midst of that protest. We marched for miles. Someone should have told me you march that much when you engage in a protest. And just like South Florida always does, it started to rain and it just poured down on us. It was quick, but it was enough to soak us. When it was all over said and done, I was soaking wet, but I had marched miles and I felt hopeful. Hopeful that we had addressed racial and ethnic inequality, that we had marched in protest. I got back on the train, went home, walked in the door, and my mom asked me, as she always does, "How was your day? What did you do?" And I told her, "Well, Mom, I killed racism." I had the big old Superman pose to her. You know, she said to me, "That's good, son. Keep up the good work." In that moment, I really did feel as though I had killed off racism. We had marched. We had protested. We had put forth our concerns on that day. Fast forward 25 years. And over the course of those 25 years, that childhood optimism has faded some. Indeed, I did not kill off racism or discrimination or racial bias that day. Actually, it has aged with me. It's grown. It's become more sophisticated, smarter, wealthier, more conniving, and it still exists in American society. We saw it on full display over the course of this summer. One incident in particular was the moment in which I saw that George Floyd tape with the officer's knee on George Floyd's neck. Man, that moved me to jump up and go engage. And so that's exactly what I did. I went and started protesting out in Philadelphia. I couldn't stop there. I said to myself, I got to take advantage of this moment. This is the time to put out my concerns. So I jumped in the car, drove 1,200 miles to Minneapolis so I can also engage in a protest there. We protested for days. And you know, it was different than 25 years ago. I mean, for sure, I still felt hopeful, but it seemed more diverse. There were individuals that as a black man didn't look like me, whose outcry actually drowned out my own. Yet, when some looked at that protest, they didn't see what I saw. They saw nothing but fire and brimstone. It's actually interesting trying to understand protests in America today, because society today has changed, especially in the way they look at race in protest. We are becoming an aspiring post-racial society. And this inspiration sometimes brings about criticism, such as that coming from the President of the United States. When he saw those protests and the many that followed, he felt as though there should be law and order put on those protests. Not only that, he took it a step further and said that he wants the silent majority to stand with him against these protests. He wasn't the first person to introduce this term, the silent majority. We've seen this term before, actually with another president talking about protests. Richard Nixon, 1960s, making his way across California. He saw a protester with a sign that said, "Bring the boys home," pushing back against the Vietnam War. Nixon said it would be unjust for him to listen to the isolated opinions of one or two individuals, and he asked for the silent majority to stand with him. In that moment, we knew that that term had a racial bend to it. The civil rights movement were out there protesting against the war as well. The reason why was because black and brown soldiers were coming home in body bags disproportionate to other individuals. It was so bad that Martin Luther King encouraged young black men to not join the military because he felt it was an unjust war. This term, the silent majority, it died out of usage for a little bit. And then we saw it again in 2015 with none other than Donald Trump. They actually had signs created that said the silent majority stands with Trump. And from what I understand, you could buy these signs on Amazon for the low price of $14.35. And then they also say that it had sturdy paper material, and they gave it 2 and 3 thumbs up. Apart from the actual signs about the silent majority standing with Trump, there was this rhetoric coming from the president put on to protesters, oftentimes those belonging to the Black Lives Matter movement. He's made statements saying maybe he should have been roughed up. I'd like to punch him in the face, and he's nasty as hell. And even in 2020 this summer, we saw notions of the silent majority, where the president put forth this understanding that the silent majority is stronger than ever. When you hear those words, it makes you question whether or not there's a divide between those individuals putting forth their passionate concerns about race on the street and those individuals who are sitting home listening, observing, but saying to themselves, I don't care about these individuals. If the individuals sitting at home are the silent majority, then what does that make me, who's on the street protesting? Am I the loud minority? Am I also alone? Is no one listening to what I have to put forth? Is no one embracing this message that we need to change society now for the better along the issues of race? Should I not engage in protests? Is it not worth it? Some might say, indeed, it's not. Before the 2020 protests, individuals had criticized protest activity. Some wrote articles saying, is there any point to protesting? Others went forth and criticized protests and said that the individuals who are engaging in protests in the NFL, they shouldn't do that. Those protesters led by Colin Kaepernick, disrespecting the flag. Even those individuals who were once involved in protests questioned whether or not they were doing the right thing. Some of the statements they made were, the people's sovereignty is dead, and every protest is a hopeless struggle to revive the corpse. My favorite criticism of protest comes here. One person said, protesting, acting up, and acting out will not do it. The age of movement politics is over, at least for now. It does make me question, can we make a difference with racial protests? Can we change the world? Can we change society? Can we change government? I believe that we can. What protests on race is able to do is it's able to inform the American public. Individuals in society aren't always aware of racial discrimination, police brutality, and flat-out racism occurring in black and brown communities in areas like Oakland, Prince George County, Miami, New York, Atlanta. And when protest takes place, it informs the public. This is the reality of our day-to-day life. Also, protest has this ability to draw the attention of government officials. You know, the government officials, they can focus on any issue they want. Protest allows for race to rise on the policy agenda. So instead of maybe focusing strictly on the economy, or focusing strictly on education broadly, or even specifically on COVID, though rightly so, individuals can expand their approach to addressing the concerns of the American public by also talking and addressing race, by putting forth bills and policies. Finally, what protest is able to do is just able to increase the saliency of this issue. When we do nothing, individuals lull their conscience to believe that these forms of bias are okay. And it's not. It's not okay to have your knee on a man's neck until he cries out for his mother, and then the life is taken and sucked from him. It's not okay to go into someone's house unannounced and begin to open fire and kill them in the wee hours of the night. It's not okay to mistakenly walk into the home of someone as a police officer and then shoot them dead as they're sitting and standing in their own home. It's not okay for the police to come across a young black man, shoot him 20 times because he's holding a cell phone as he stands in the back of his grandmother's house. It's not okay for a police officer to routinely stop someone, and in that traffic stop, for that person to tell an officer, listen, I have a registered gun, but then to shoot him dead while a 4-year-old watches in the back. And God knows it's not okay for a 12-year-old to be on a playground playing with a toy BB gun and police officers to roll up on him within seconds and shoot him dead. It's not okay. And that is what protest says. That's what it's able to do, is to bring salience to these various issues and many, many more. Hey, I'm theorizing here. Others have speculated about the impact of racial protests. We can move beyond the theory and speculation and actually see, how does protest affect America? That's what I've spent my life trying to do, to assess and analyze protests for decades. In order for me to show you the impact of protest, I need to figure out some way to measure protest, literally quantify it, so I can show you this impact. In order to do that, what I've done is I've begun the process of counting protests over the years. And what I've also done is I've enlisted the best and the brightest Penn undergraduate and graduate students to help me in this process. We have combed through thousands of newspapers to indicate, when did protests take place in America? And when did it take place on race? Students coded the time periods in which protests occurred. And then we trained computers to mimic the behavior of research assistants. We're creating our own sort of AIs here. Once the computers have been trained, they then would go out and code incidents of protest across millions of pieces of newspaper articles. We are now able to not only look at protests, but we are also able to look at the context, the organizations involved, the length of time, the contentious nature of protest activity. Once we've done this, I can show you when protest jumps up and when it jumps down in areas of race. We can do one even better. I can look at protests across space. These are the different places in which racial protests have occurred in America in the 1960s. We can look at it in the 1970s, the 1980s, and even the 1990s and beyond. And then we can actually bring up that whole social science skill set and create empirical statistical models so that we're able to tease out not only when does protest have an impact, but exactly by how much the immediate and direct impact of protests. After going through all these sort of fancy statistics, what we've come to realize is that racial protest is able to bring about change. It's able to change the way politicians think, and it speaks to the American public. If you look at every single branch of government at the federal level, it's influencing them. Take a look at Congress. When protest occurs, it's impacting individuals and how they vote on bills. Now, in order to understand the impact of protest in Congress, we have to listen to the words of Richard Fenno. Now, I believe in the adage of Martin Luther King. He says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I mean, I believe in those words. But here, in trying to understand the impact of protests on race and its effect on Congress, you got to also listen to the words of Richard Fenno. Now, it's not often I take the words of Richard Fenno over Martin Luther King, some random political scientist, but here I think it's appropriate because Richard Fenno, the political scientist, said, if you get too far away from your district, you'll lose it. The reality is that politicians care about what's going on in their backyard. So when protests on race occurs in Philadelphia, that politician in Philadelphia is going to pay more attention than protests that might be happening in Miami or in Phoenix or in New York. When we look at protests in representatives' backyard, we see that Democrats and Republicans are more likely to sponsor, support, vote for bills that address racial and ethnic inequality. The more protests in their backyard, the more likely they are to be favorable about addressing racial and ethnic minority concerns. This is taking place with Congress. It's also taking place with the president, at least historically, if you look at the Oval Office. In those moments in which racial protests occurred, we saw the president put forth executive orders, which is close to legislation, make statements, memos, press conferences that dealt with race. I mean, look at Lyndon B. Johnson, the highest moments in which he's addressing race. Birmingham is in the background. Nixon, the Chicano movement. If we're looking at Carter, you got the Black College Day marches. Reagan, anti-apartheid protests. Also Bush, LA riots. And Clinton, the Million Man March. And it goes on and on and on. Congress, the president, even the Supreme Court. In the walls there of the court system, when protest occurs in America that deals with race, justices are more likely to take cases that revolve around racial and ethnic minority concerns. And those justices are more likely to vote in a direction that pushes for racial equality in America. Clearly, the voices of individuals over time appealing for racial progress, they're being heard. Now, you might say to me, Dan, that's great and wonderful and all. Actually, pretty talented of you. However, that was back then. Now, protest has changed. It's not as effective. It's not going to make an impact. I mean, have you watched Fox News? The reality is that I buy the change. Protest is slightly different. You know, you don't have the same sort of leaders. The organizational structure has changed some. The characteristics are a little different. But the impact that protest has, it has remained the same. Actually, individuals are more willing to hear out protesters now than they ever have before. In addition to running those numbers, for the last 4 years, I have spent time literally walking amongst protesters, sitting at the water cooler, chatting and talking with them, trying to understand their concerns, and then assessing how the American public viewed their passionate concerns, and seeing whether or not representatives are able to pay attention and change their perspectives as a consequence. What I've found is that individuals are listening, but they're listening through an ideological lens. Gone are the days in which an individual will see maybe pro-life protests and say, oh, that's just pro-life protests. Or they see racial protests and say, no, that's just racial protests. What they actually say is, oh, that's pro-life protest. That must be those conservatives. And if they see racial protests, they say to themselves, clearly those are them liberals walking around. It has become an ideological way of looking at protests. To some extent, that's not all bad, because that means that when individuals are putting forth their passionate concerns about race, there are others outside of the movement who are listening, who are paying attention, who are concerned, and who are willing to go to the polls to change what is taking place in America. This impact on protests and the way that it affects voters, it is seen at each level of the electoral process: campaign contributions, voter turnout, electoral outcomes. We can walk through each of those stages and see how the loud minority is shaping the silent majority. Take, for example, campaign contributions. Now, you probably didn't imagine that protest is able to influence the way money exchanges hands in campaigns. But the reality is that protest is a multi-billion-dollar industry. When protest occurs, it influences the way that individuals contribute and donate to campaigns. Take, for example, Phoenix, Arizona, and Portland, Oregon. Now, you wouldn't think that Phoenix, Arizona, and Portland, Oregon would be the hub of protests. But from 2016 to 2018, there were a plethora of protest activity that occurred here. On average, any zip code from 2016 to 2018 had about 8 liberal protests. However, in Phoenix, we saw 138 protests. In Portland, 126 protests. Now, on average, individuals give around $14,000. That's the most coming, or the average coming from a zip code collectively. However, from Phoenix, we saw around $30-some thousand coming out of Phoenix, going into the campaigns of various Democratic candidates. From Portland, Oregon, we saw around $60,000 leaving out as a consequence of protests. And it's going out across the country. Individuals are donating to campaigns in Miami, in places in Pittsburgh, in places in California. That's Phoenix. In Portland, all throughout the entire country. Protest is influencing the way individuals give. It also influences who turns out to vote. Take a look at 2016, the Black Lives Matter movement. You might say to me, well, Dan, it didn't have an effect. Black Lives Matter, they didn't get the person they won elected in 2016. Remember, protest, especially on race, is a localized affair. And so let's look at the places in which the Black Lives Matter protest took place in 2016. These are the different locations. Now, from 2012 to 2016, black voter turnout dropped. And it's expected. President Obama wasn't on the ticket. There was an enthusiasm gap. It dropped by around 1.2%. However, in those places that saw Black Lives Matter protests, black and brown communities came out and voted. In Minneapolis, in the 5th Congressional District, 13 Black Lives Matter protests led to around a 2.5% increase in black voters turning out. The 8 Black Lives Matter protests that took place in Philadelphia led to around a 1.5% increase in the African American community turning out to vote. So these protests are having an impact on a localized level. What about electoral outcomes? Well, when protest occurs, it is able to influence how individuals vote. Let me be very succinct. Just 50 protest events, let's assume they deal with race, that are liberal, are going to lead to the Republican decreasing their two-party vote share by 6%, and Democrats increasing their vote share by 2%. That's an 8% swing. See, we can run fancy numbers now that we've counted all the protests and we can quantify its impact. This has happened. It's not the first time. Look at Abner Mikva, an individual who ran for office in 1966 and lost. But he ran again in 1968 and won overwhelmingly. Why? It's because the civil rights movement descended on his district, and he supported those protest events. He actually helped bail some of them out of jail. He got behind them and supported individuals who were willing to move in that direction, and they voted him in office. This impact has taken place in 2018 across the board for various representatives. I've provided you a really nice picture of how racial protests can be impactful. You might say, well, what about the pushback? I mean, there is indeed a situation in which individuals have voiced their concerns pushing back. And it's not just a pushback that is people thinking a certain way and then individuals acting a certain way. No, they are bringing their thoughts to action. We see this with White Lives Matter in a sort of more, less overt fashion. But we've seen it in a more overt fashion with all-out white supremacist organizations and individuals just pushing back in the most egregious way. In my years of studying this and studying protests, especially on race, what I've found is that those negative sentiments do not lead to individuals voting a certain way or even coming out to the polls. Take 2016, for example. We analyzed the way in which individuals felt about the Black Lives Matter movement. And trust me, there were some people that absolutely hated the Black Lives Matter movement, and there was much vitriol. However, their negative sentiments did not influence whether or not they voted. Other factors influenced their vote, such as their education or their age. However, on the flip side, those individuals that had a positive perception about the Black Lives Matter movement or about black protests, those individuals were more likely to go to the polls. There's a true story of love overcoming hate here. The positive perceptions of protest is winning the day. After hearing all of this, taking a bird's eye view of how protests on race can be influential, I have no choice but to say that protests, they are the canaries in the coal mines that warn of future political and electoral change. They make a difference. My passionate concerns are being heard. And it's not only that. Protest is able to not only influence the way in which politicians behave, but it's able to put individuals in office who are going to be more favorable to my passionate concerns about race. What expectations do we have for the 2020 elections? Well, if we're looking ahead to 2020, which is only a couple of weeks away, I mean, early November, we'll see what takes place. The one thing I can say about those elections is that the myth of the silent majority just is simply that, a myth. The loud minority protesters on the ground are speaking to the silent majority. And those discussions are going to move to actions, I believe, in November. Last thing I'll leave you with. Stop. Stop for a moment. Listen. Do you hear it? Demonstrators' feet pounding the ground. Signs being hoisted in the air as they ruffle. The chants coming from the distance. Indeed, that is the slow beating heart of American democracy.
Talk. Please pause and recognize you for your contributions here. Thank you. I hope you'll come and join me and we can have a conversation. Yes, we're trying to abide by all the proper health issues here. Thank you. Oh, that's great. You know, this is such an important, your work is so important, timely. There's so much that we could talk about. In his introduction to the lecture, Provost Pritchett calls protests a cause for hope. And as I read through your work, and as you convey here, I agree. Your work is inherently optimistic. Mm-hmm. You see protests as a mechanism of change, a way to get issues on the political agenda, a way to create social change, a way to hopefully address some of these really deep, you know, the deep systemic racism and other issues that we have to address. One thing that you didn't talk about much was the questions we have now about the integrity of the voting process. And so I'm hoping you can help us make sense of some of these challenges right now and how that influences your thinking.
Well, thanks so much for having this conversation with me, and I want to thank Wendell so much for that wonderful introduction to things. It's really an important event that we host here. Yes, the electoral process is in question now. Exactly what will take place, and are we certain that votes will count? You know, one thing that takes place every year is that it's tough for racial and ethnic minorities to cast their ballot without feeling as though they're ostracized. You have, and feeling as though there's voter disenfranchisement across the country. There's no doubt that there are fewer polls available, longer lines for individuals to go vote. Now you find yourself in a situation in which we have a pandemic that's amplified by a postmaster that does not seem like they want to make this happen. That's going to be problematic in the Black and brown communities that I talk about. It's already occurring. There is misinformation out there. There is a lack of understanding of how to cast a ballot, when is the due date, and if this is taking place right now, I can only imagine what's going to take place on election day. I actually heard from some of my students who said they had to wait hours to vote. What is going to happen in places in North Carolina and Black and brown communities in which we know they had to wait hours to vote, or in rural areas? It is of great concern. So in an ideal world, protest is able to influence individuals and mobilize them, but there's this countervailing force that's taking place, some of which individuals are creating, but some of which is not the fault of anyone. It's just the circumstances we find ourselves in that might taint the impact that activists might have.
Yeah, it's yes, and and part of what you just talked about there is some of the additional, structural racism that's been built into our system, and you provided such a compelling description of, some of the many issues, the police murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and so many others. We also have the disproportionate negative effects of the pandemic on economic and physical well-being of Black and brown people and communities. So what are, for the next president, you gave some very hopeful examples of how other presidents in the past have taken actions to try to help us do better as a nation on these issues. What, if you were able to provide recommendations to the next president, what would you say?
Well, if I was a part of the, in some cabinet position, or if the president sent me a note and said, "Hey, Dan, what do you think about these issues?" I have a lot to tell him. I have to be able to synthesize it. I have a lot to say.
Yes.
But I believe what's important is to hear out the concerns of people of color, to understand their issues and their concerns. But I would also say that in order to address racial inequality today, you got to take a very precise approach. This previous notion of trying to address unique problems, let's say in Black communities, by having these big social policy programs that don't address the specific concerns of the Black community is problematic. And so at some point in time, while all people of color are experiencing hardship, there's no doubt that Black communities are, I would say, incurring disproportionately the brunt of that anguish and pain. And it's not just there. I mean, you look at unemployment, education, there need to be more policies that take into consideration the unique concerns of these communities and put those forth. And so that's what I would do in terms of a list of those concerns. There's a host of concerns. You should have greater discussions about reparations. There should be discussions about police brutality in the Black community. There should be discussions specifically about funding HBCUs and then trickling that down to Black communities, making sure that individuals have the resources to get a good education. And even small things like parks and being able to enjoy the environment around them. Check caching places. I mean, I have a litany, I told you, of recommendations. But there's a lot to do. You just need to be more specific on how you address it.
Right. Well, one of the things I love about your work is how you focus on the need for change at multiple levels.
Yeah.
Local, state, national. Colleges and universities are another level too, and many colleges across the country have seen protests in part in response to police practices on college campuses. What do you see as the role? Does the role of protests play out the same way in colleges and universities? How do you see it operating within higher ed?
Protest, I think, is effective at any level, and no matter who decides to do it. There's these anti-lockdown protests that's taking place, and I think they have been effective in voicing their concerns. At the collegiate level, protests are also important. I think the reason why protest is effective for politicians is because they don't have an agenda that's all-knowing. They don't know every single unique concern that's happening in these various communities. And so what protest does is it provides a form of information for them. And I think the same can be said for some of our administrators across the country. They are doing their best to make sure that they hear out the concerns of students. But if it's a situation that they're not aware of what's transpiring and what's taking place, it's like a tree falling in the woods and no one's around to hear it. And so that's what protest is able to do, is bring these issues to the forefront at colleges and universities. And I think there's a definite role for it, probably a greater role here than in other places, because at least there's a greater surveying of the American people outside of colleges and universities. How many surveys do we conduct on the sentiments of students during the semester? Not too many. So there can be major issues that take place that we are not aware of. And so it's good to hear from students for sure. Last point I'll say about the college campuses is that protest is really important for marginalized groups. Even if you conducted surveys, some of those surveys are going to have a majoritarian construct about them. That means you're going to take into consideration what the majority says. However, on college campuses, such as Penn and other places that are some of our top tier universities, the percentage of African Americans and people of color, it's low. So how do you understand what their passionate concerns are about? You take a survey, it's going to be hard to tease that out. But when individuals are engaging in protest, it's like, okay, I see what this maybe 3%, 4%, or 8% of the population feels, and that is important. And now they can react to it.
Yeah, that's great. Another point that you made in the talk, you make in your most recent book, you talk about how protests can encourage a sense of connection to others and advancing a common purpose. And I think that is building on some of the ideas you just talked about there. At the same time, you also note that ideological protest may, quote unquote, ideological protest may lead individuals to become more partisan. And in your talk, you said, well, maybe that's not all bad. A lot of people are worried about partisanship and the deep divide. And so can you help us make sense? Is there a way for protests to help bridge the divide, or maybe is that not the right way to think about this?
The divide is bad. I mean, we should be divided but globally speaking, from a broad perspective, we don't want a society that can't talk to each other about these important issues. Regardless if you are a Democrat or Republican, you should be able to come to the table and engage in an honest discussion. But the reality is that we live in a very polarized America. And because of that, it is the case that when individuals see protests, they do see it through an ideological lens. And that is the sort of trying to make lemonade out of lemons. That is the positive aspect of a bad situation. And individuals are likely to connect with one another because of this ideological bend. That doesn't mean, however, that protesters can influence individuals who see things in a different way. It's just that it's a harder get. It definitely can influence individuals who are more independent, who don't really have, haven't thrown their name in the hat quite yet. They're just seeing things as they occur, and they're willing to be persuaded by one side or the other. But yes, polarization in America is not the greatest thing. I'm hoping for a better future. But that being said, in the current environment we live right now, it is shaping how protest is perceived.
Mm-hmm. And so taking that a step further, I think, and you talked about the silent majority and, some of the extreme response to, the counter-protest to the protests. Some of this is pretty worrisome, right? If we look at the violence and whatnot that's happened in some places. Tension between peaceful protest and violence is not new. One of the strengths of your work is its historical view. Yeah. Is there something else that you could tell us to help think about, the role of counter-protest and where you see us as I guess both locally and nationally as we think about that tension between protest and counter-protest?
That tension has existed in America for a very long time. And now we just are able to see it front and center on television screens, our social media accounts, newspapers are covering it more. When the Little Rock Nine was making their way to that school, there were a swarm of white residents that were like, "You shall not pass." And they looked to push back on these individuals as young black men and women sat at lunch counter. Had things dumped on them. The counter-protest has existed in America for a very long time. So I just want to make sure that I put that out there. However, what has changed is the way in which counter-protest is taking place. Take, for example, White Lives Matter. Individuals have become, I think, disillusional with the fact that in saying those things, I'm not affecting Black Lives Matter. I'm not pushing against them. I'm just saying that my life matters as well. And so you have this form of counter-protest in which individuals don't realize that they're part of the counter-protest, which is, I think, pragmatic and not helpful for us as a nation. Individuals have to realize that some of their actions that they engage in, they might not see it as pushing back, but indeed they are, and that can be pragmatic. Second thing I'll say about this is that there's no doubt that over the last 4 years, individuals have become emboldened to put forth their racial bias and engage in discrimination in ways that we haven't seen for some time. It's no wonder the FBI has focused in on white nationalists and hate groups, because they've come from underneath that rock. And it's questionable whether or not they were even under a rock. But the reality is that they're out front now, and that's being guided by the statements of the President of the United States. I mean, we don't need to sugarcoat this. When the President refuses to denounce white supremacy, and at that moment that he stopped, it felt like it was forever. Also, when you have situations, he indicated that he didn't say this, but I mean, representatives are, I guess, lying when he said that they were derogative S-hole countries and things like that. I mean, these sort of statements criticizing LeBron James for trying to engage in social activism, negative statements to Maxine Waters. I mean, you just go down the list. There's a litany of things that are pragmatic, but those are dog whistles in codes. And now they're no longer dog whistles and codes. They're just whistles, and they've decoded the code, and that's pragmatic, but that is amplifying the pushback for us to move to our better angels.
Yeah, that's really interesting. My next question was going to be about leadership, and it's just, I hadn't really thought about it the way that you just conceptualized it. So in your book, it's very clear, right? So protest can help to put items on the political agenda. You can vote new people in, lead to changes in vote in the elected officials. Yeah. The president, gave good examples about the role of leadership in the counter-protest. You started your talk with the March on Washington, and often, so 250,000 people marched, individuals marched. Yeah. But when we think of the March on Washington, we often think about the leaders, John Lewis, Martin Luther King. How do you have, I'm curious about the organization and leadership within the protests, on the protest side, and how that's changed over time and how we can think about that.
There's no doubt, too, that protest has changed. The way in which this generation sees protest is very different than the way John Lewis or King saw protests. I always, when I'm comparing them, I try not to see one as being better or worse, but rather it's just different approaches that they've taken. I would say that the current movement is definitely leaderless. I mean, you have individuals who are putting forth their concerns, and the Black Lives Matter organization has definitely mobilized individuals together. But there are people who march and demonstrate and protest that don't agree with every bullet point that Black Lives Matter has put out. And that's okay. I feel that many individuals come into this seeking the same overall goal, which is racial equality, doing away with police brutality. However, the way in which that is accomplished might be different, and they might not buy into every statement that the organization is putting forth. And so that is a huge change and a huge difference than what we've seen in the civil rights movement. It is also something that has allowed the movement to grow. I mean, you take a look. After the incidents with George Floyd in the summer, you had protests in Great Britain, you had protests in Germany, you had protests around the world. Everyone is saying, hey, I want to be a part of this as well. So, this generation here is a generation that is just not going to sit back and take it. And those little small grievances that individuals in the 1960s and 1970s would have maybe tolerated, this generation says no, and they're going to try and push back any way they can, in any form and fashion that they can. And so it's different. But I choose to believe it's moving us further along the racial progress. The same way in the 60s, King's approaches were different than those in the black community in the 1940s and even the 1930s, but they moved us along. This is just now another level of moving us along to racial progress. Yeah,
that's great. And you've done such a nice, terrific job, really, of the collection of data to help understand what's happened systematically over time. Another aspect in which this current cycle is different is with, the Democratic Convention being virtual, more events really being virtual in this current time. How do you think that might play out going forward? And perhaps this is related to the role of social media and how people connect each other, but I'm wondering, has the virtual convening and the role of social media changed potentially the role of protest?
Well, the virtual space is a space that many of us are learning to, get used to. We're adapting to it, especially in our classrooms. I teach a course on social movements, and that's different. Talking to people in a seminar for 2 to 3 hours about protests in a virtual space. But we're learning how to do that. And protesters have used technology to their benefit. One of the reasons why some of the protests, let's take Egyptian protests that were occurring around, I think, 2016, reason why that was influential. And the reason why a lot of protests happening in America has been influential is because individuals can go online, go to their social media account, say, hey, there's a protest taking place on 40th and Chestnut. Let's all come together. And so now that information is disseminated quickly, within minutes, to individuals who can just take up the phone and be like, okay, we're protesting today. Something else about technology that makes protests, I think, really important is that it's able to counter the messages that sometimes the national media might try and put forth, those narratives. So, as I indicated in my talk, there are some media outlets that will characterize protests as nothing but fire and brimstone and nothing but death. However, when you have social media, Twitter and Facebook, individuals can have conversations with one another and say, no, this is what's going on. It's not that way. And so this sort of misinformation or the national media trying to push individuals in a certain way can be counteracted with discussions by everyday average individuals. Sometimes, though, that can that can become a problem, but because those conversations can go awry and it can be negative. I don't know if I'm an optimistic guy or something, but I think that it is a powerful means for individuals to get together, to talk, to organize in a way that can address the concerns in society.
And so another way to think about it is in terms of your own work, right, and what you are trying to accomplish for your work. And I would imagine that we have a number of people at various career stages who are watching, including some more junior scholars trying to figure out, they cared passionately about these issues, trying to make a difference in this space. You write for in venues targeted towards academics. You also have an article in the September issue of The Atlantic, which is terrific. Can you talk about how you think of yourself as a scholar and how you think about public scholarship, how you think about how you do the work you do and why?
That's a very good question, one in which I've had to wrestle with over time because I talk about race, I talk about protests, I talk about the American presidency. That's what I do research on. So there is, I think, ample space for me to contribute to the public sector. I have actually, early in my career, I didn't speak as much to the public, speak to people outside of academia. I didn't write op-ed pieces because I wanted to make sure I got over the tenure hump. And we know the pressures of making sure you make it through that. That being said, I would still be involved in other ways. I would engage in civic activism. I would go to organizations. I mean, I'm deeply entrenched in the Black community, understanding their concerns. Once I was able to establish a more sort of stable ground in academia, then I said, I can venture out and do a little bit of this. The reality is, though, that some of the young scholars coming up, they're engaging in research that none of the older scholars are doing, important research. And it's the onus is on them to say something while they're also trying to deal with how much can I say, how much time can I dedicate to this without burdening myself. But in this current moment, over the last summer, few people could remain quiet. And I saw op-eds being written across the board, junior, senior, it didn't matter. And sometimes we need that. And I think that was a changing moment in which you'll see more people contributing to the public space and offering different perspectives. And I think that is fantastic. They should be cognizant that they do got to get over the tenure hump. But if you got the time, you got a moment, you feel like you got something to say, get it out there.
Yeah, that's great. So what's next for you? You have a terrific record, several wonderful books. I'm sure you have lots of ideas.
You know, when you try and get out, they pull you back in. Talking about the protests. I wrote this book about protests, but I'm fascinated with what's happening now. Like, what's going to happen in the elections? I gave this whole spiel about protests being able to affect. I don't know exactly what's going to take place in the beginning of November, and then what's going to take place afterwards. In January and February, and I think that that's going to be an interesting discussion, and so I'm torn. My next book project that's under contract that I got to have delivered to Cambridge at some point in time is about racial inequality in America. And it's looking at policies and it's looking at racial inequality. But protest in America is still very important. So what I might end up doing is splitting my time with trying to address racial inequality in America with that book, and also holding on a little bit to this protest, if nothing else, maybe writing a couple of op-ed pieces or contributing in some way in that sector. So that is, that's me. We got to see.
Yeah, that's great. Well, the work that you're doing is just so important, and there are so many other interesting questions. It's been interesting to see the protests not only in the U.S. this summer, but also across the world. And then, just that we've focused most specifically on the Black Lives Matter protests, but, protests intersect with each other, and, so.
Absolutely. I mean, they really do. I mean, that's one, I presented notions of race and protest, but there are major intersections between Black Lives Matter, the women's movement in March. You also have protests against guns in schools as a part of that. I mean, this is why I think that 2020 is probably going to be one of the greatest elections affected by protests, because there's been so much liberal ideological protest occurring in America that is mobilizing various groups across the board to say, hey, we need to do something about this.
Yeah, agreed. So we're just about out of time.
Yeah.
I want to make sure you have the last word on this. What else should we take away from this time with you?
Well, I would just say this, that when individuals go and put forth their passionate concerns, there are many people that they were like me, a young teenager engaging in protest, walking in the hot sun, then being rained on, whatever sort of trials and tribulations you've had to deal with when you engage in protest. You do at the end of that question whether or not you've made a difference, whether or not people are hearing you, whether I should pack it in. And the reality is that you matter. You matter. You matter. Your concerns are being heard. And so civic activism is a way for you to express yourself. And it's part of this democratic process. And so keep up the good fight. And John Lewis say, get in good trouble here. Also, the final thing I want to say is go vote.
Right.
That's important.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll underscore that. We're close to the election. Please take the time to vote. It's just such an important right and privilege that we have.
Absolutely.
Professor Gillian, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. It's been a real privilege to hear your perspectives. Thank you for your good work.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's been wonderful. I appreciate it.
Great. And thank you all for coming. Please take care and stay well.